Passage, we're going to be looking at a really important story, I think, in the Gospel of Mark. So Jesus has just come down the mountain with a small group of his disciples, and they've just seen him transfigured and in glory. And this is on the background of just before that, Jesus explaining to them that he was going to suffer and die before being raised from the dead, and that he was calling them to live that same kind of life, to die to themselves so that they can ultimately live for him. And they've had this glimpse of what the glory will eventually be like, to encourage them to be willing to go through the trials and suffering. So the other disciples, though, haven't gotten to see that vision yet. They're down in the valley, so to speak, and there's this big dispute that's broken out because they have been unable to cast a demon out of a young boy. And the interesting thing here is the disciples had been able to cast out demons in the past. Jesus had sent them out back in chapter 6, and they had successfully cast out demons. And so they're a little puzzled as to why they weren't able to do it this time. And Jesus comes back, and we see some exasperation on Jesus' part. And I think it's most focused on the disciples, who seem not to be very much farther than anybody else, not really understanding who he is and what he's about and trusting in him. I think there's a couple of things that we can take from this passage. I mean, one of them is there's kind of two rebukes. They're rebuked for being faithless, and they're at the end rebuked, I think, for their lack of prayer. And I don't even think we should necessarily assume they never prayed in any sense when they were trying to cast out this demon. I think Jesus is talking about a more general prayerlessness that's part of their kind of everyday way of thinking and talking. We see Jesus repeatedly going to God in prayer, depending on God to help him do what needs to be done. And I think somehow in the disciples, there's a spirit of self-reliance that manifests both a lack of faith in God and a lack of reliance on him that's seen in their lack of prayer. And I think this is something that's really important for us to talk to Cornerstone about, and really important to talk about in our connection groups. I think it can be very easy for us to assume that because God has worked through us in the past, God will just automatically keep working through us in the future. As we talk about planting churches in Ankeny and other places around Iowa, as we talk about trying to do more and more of work for the kingdom, it would be an enormous mistake for us to assume that just because we've seen what God has already done, that somehow there's something in us where we can just sort of show up and amazing God things are going to happen. Over and over again, we just have daily to be coming back to God and saying, God, we are completely reliant on you. If this is going to be of you, you are the one that's going to do it. And the way we're going to, I think, have a barometer of how we're doing in that is actually just what Jesus says, prayer. How often do we pray, and what do we pray for? Are we praying for God's kingdom to come, for him to use us, for him to use our church to make his name great? Are we saying, God, we are completely reliant on you to glorify your name? Those are the kinds of prayers that I think the disciples weren't praying. And that lack of prayer manifests itself in their inability to do God's work. But I think there's also something hopeful in this passage that we see, which is the Father. He comes to Jesus, and he has this mix of, he's desperate, he wants Jesus' help, but he's now not sure. I mean, the disciples weren't able to do it. So he says, Jesus, if you can, would you help my son? And Jesus says, if you can. It's not a question of whether I can, it's a question of faith. Do you believe? And the man says, well, I believe, help my unbelief. And I think this is a perfect picture of how we grow in faith. I think there's lots of us who would say, I wish I prayed more than I did. I wish I prayed with greater faith than I do. The trick is not to sit around saying, God, once you give me more faith, then I'll pray more. Instead, it's to do what this man did, which is to come with whatever bit of faith we have, even if it's just a mustard seed's worth. Come to Jesus with whatever faith you have and be willing to trust him. This man is willing to trust his son to Jesus, even though he has doubts mixed in with his faith. Whatever the next step of obedience, of sacrifice, of service, whatever it is that Jesus is calling you to, step out in faith and trust him with whatever bit of faith you have and watch what God does, because that's how faith grows. At the end of this story, this man has more faith in Jesus than he did when it started, because he took the bit of faith he had and was able to see how Jesus responded to it. Well, then we get some other stories that are really important as well. We get Jesus talking to the disciples again and again reiterating his main theme. I am going to die. I'm in fact even going to be betrayed, but I'm going to rise again. And the disciples, again, don't know what to make of this. And how much they don't get what Jesus keeps telling them about how the road to glory is through servanthood and suffering is manifest as they start having this argument about which of them is the greatest. And that's when Jesus pulls aside a child and says, look, you don't get it. The path to greatness is through servitude. In fact, this child who is insignificant in your eyes, serving the insignificant, receiving them, welcoming them, that is the path to greatness in my kingdom. And I wonder if in our day, if Jesus might go to a nursing home and point to an older person and say, the way you receive this person is the way you receive me. Serve people like this. Our culture glorifies youth, whereas theirs tended to neglect the youth. So I wonder if in our day Jesus might flip things around, and whether it's the old or the sick or the poor, the recurring theme in Luke is this: being a humble servant who's willing to serve where we see there are needs. That's what it looks like to pick up our cross, to die to ourselves, and to follow the path that Jesus has blazed for us. And I think talking to our connection group about what would it mean for us as a connection group, for us as individuals to live more like that, will be a great conversation for you to have in your groups this week.